For day 2, for our watercolor paintings, we're going to be removing the tape and adding details. Carefully begin by taking off the tape. It may tear your paper slightly. That's all right. Do your best to not tear it too much. Remove the tape slowly to make sure that it does as little damage to the paper as possible. Make sure you take care of all of your trees. When you're done, make sure that you take and wad your tape up into a ball and put it in the garbage can. Do not throw these or play with them when you're in class. For today, you're going to need a brush. You'll notice today we're using a smaller brush than last time. This says size 4. Look for one around that number. Today you're also going to need your set of watercolors and you're going to need water. Make sure that you're sharing the water at your tables. You may also need a paper towel so you'll be able to brush off some of the extra amount of water that you need. Today we're going to be using a few techniques. One of them is going to be wash. One of them is going to be dry brush. And then the last one that we'll be using today will just be standard watercoloring. To start with, today we need to make our birch tree marks to make sure that these look like birch trees. To do that, we're going to need to make gray paint again. Remember, to make gray, I take a small amount of blue. I'll mix it in the top of my palette. You won't need much today, so don't worry about mixing a large amount. Then I'm going to take a small amount of brown and I'll mix the two together. This will make a very, very dark gray blue. Next, brush some of your extra water off on your paper towel. Just have a little bit of watercolor on your brush, and you're going to be drawing small little marks. You're doing horizontal lines throughout the tree. Don't put them all right next to each other and try not to make them too thick. Don't forget about putting some on the smaller branches on the side too. You may need to add a bit more water to your paper or paintbrush. Careful not to to make sure that you're painting the whole tree, especially as you get closer to the bottom. Many times, students will stop painting when they reach the snow line. If you'll do this, it'll make your birch tree look like the shadow is floating. You'll notice that a shadow is down at the bottom. Make sure that as you paint, you're painting all the way down to where your shadow is. That way, it'll look like the birch tree is going all the way down to the shadow. Continue to do this for each one of your trees. You can add a lot or a little for your markings. How many you add is up to you, and how large you make them is also up to you. If you need to mix more of your gray, black, or blue, go ahead. Now, this technique is called dry brush. The reason it's called dry brush is because for the most part I'm using a very dry paintbrush. I'm not adding a lot of water to my brush. If I'm using a lot of water, it's going to make my picture much more runny. It's going to have large spots like we saw up here. So I'm just going to continue to draw my lines, horizontal lines, all the way to the bottom of my tree. Try not to go outside of the lines of the trees. Try not to paint into the sky or too much into the snow. And try not to add too many lines. Now, you'll notice that as I do this, I'm not pressing very hard with my paintbrush. If I press too hard, I'm going to get very thick lines. And I don't want thick lines. I want to make sure that I have very nice, thin little lines. So I'm barely touching my paintbrush onto my paper. Sometimes I make my lines closer together. Sometimes they're further apart. Okay. Now, when it looks like you're done and you've got a few lines on there, it's time for us to go ahead and keep adding more details. For our extra details, the first thing we're going to need is a shadow on our ground. For that, I'm going to take just extra water and I'm going to add it to my gray that I've already made. With my already gray, I'm going to make sure that I get that very, 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 very wet color. And I'm going to slide it right along the snow underneath my sky. I'm just making a little line. This way, it makes it look like the snow's got a little bit of a shadow in it. I can also add other decorations with this. I could make it look like there's a bump of snow by just, again, using a little bit of gray that I've made by watering down my gray paint. The other thing I can do is start to add animal tracks or grass. Sometimes this is a winter landscape, but sometimes little pieces of grass will poke up through the ground. For that, I might use, just again, a little paint and a little bit of water, and I can make little sprouts of grass that come up. I could do these on the edges of my trees, down at the bottoms, to make it look like this. If I accidentally made my project so that my tree looks like it's floating, this is an excellent way to fix it by adding a lot of grass instead of just a little. And that will make it look like it's not floating, like it's underneath the snow again. The other thing I might do is maybe I'll want to paint a rock. For that, again, rocks are kind of a little bit grayish, so maybe I'll make up some more of my gray paint quick. This time I'm not going to use a ton of water, but I could go ahead and make just kind of a squiggly blob for a rock. Okay, I might add a couple of these to my picture. Make it look like I've got rocks sticking up. Again, I might add more grass. Again, I'm not pressing real hard as I do this. I could also make my grass different colors. Since it's winter time, my grass is kind of a little bit dead, so I could always add a little bit of brown grass in there too. Make it look like it's dying grass. I might add a little bit of yellow to get the same effect. And again, I'm using very light pressure as I push on my paper. Too much is going to make it more of a blob than a line. Don't overdo it as you're working on it. If you add too much, sometimes it's going to make it look like it's a little bit messy. Now make sure that you're not adding details inside the trees. if I take my pencil and or my paintbrush and started to draw grass inside my tree here, it'll start to look like I've got grass growing out of the inside of my tree, which I don't want. You won't see an edge in between the snow and your tree here, and that's the way we want it to look. Okay, the birch bark of a tree is white, the snow is white, so it would be difficult to see a line normally if we were to look at these outside. Again, last thing I might want to add are animal footprints. We all know that as animals walk in the snow, they leave little footprints. You can think about different types of footprints you might want. If you use gray paint and you were to make little dots, you can make it look like animals are walking. Zoom that in and go ahead and show you what I'm doing here. If I were to take and just make little circle for my paw, little dots for the toes, I can make it look like an animal is walking through the snow. Again, I'm using very, very little pressure with my brush. If I push too hard, it's going to be hard to get small details. This way I can make it look like an animal was walking. I could also make it look like I have hoof prints. If I were to go over to this spot, maybe I want to make it look like I had a deer walking through. For a deer, I'll put my brush kind of sideways like this, and I can just make two prints that are next to each other just by using the side of my brush. Try not to build it so it looks like there's actual animals in the picture. It's very difficult to layer a lot of watercolor on top of here. So just having little things is going to be key. If you try to make anything too large, it's not going to look the way you want it to.